Broadwatch, keeping your money safe. Brought to you by Commonwealth Bank.
Well, there are fears in the public sector and the corporate community about the vulnerability of intellectual property following last week's cyber attack on the Australian National University. 19 years' worth of staff and student data was compromised in the attack, prompting calls by cyber experts for more to be done to protect businesses and organisations. Joining me live now for more is Fergus Hanson, Head of International Cyber Policy Centre at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Fergus, appreciate your time today. We seem to hear of a data breach in the news almost on a daily basis at the moment. Do you think we're doing enough to prevent them?
Well, I think as your question indicates, there's a lot of work still to be done. The fact that we are hearing about so many breaches, and I think that those breaches are probably just the tip of the iceberg, really does indicate the huge amount of work that still needs to be done across the board in the Australian economy, from businesses to government down to the civil society sector and universities.
Because, of course, data breaches that we know of aren't the only ones that occur. There are certainly a lot of data breaches that happen that we don't yet know of.
Well, that's right. Australia has mandatory data breach laws that require companies and government organisations to report breaches of personal information. So if your personal record is stolen or breached, then the companies and organisations are under an obligation to make a public notification of that. The issue, though, is that doesn't cover all breaches. So, for example, when companies' intellectual property is stolen and it doesn't necessarily have personal information attached to it, that doesn't have to be reported. So that type of information isn't yet publicly known, and we only know about it from the odd story that slips out or when occasionally, companies disclose that type of information. So I think you're right, it's absolutely the tip of the iceberg problem.
Now, there are reports that China is a key suspect in last week's cyber attack on the Australian National University. How concerning is it that some of these data breaches are state-sponsored?
Well, the issue with state-sponsored cyber attacks is they basically can bring a lot more resources and determination to the table. That's quite different from cyber criminals, who tend to be individuals or small groups, and thereafter, their motivation is to make as much money as quickly as possible. So if they come up against a hard target, they're going to move on pretty quickly to something that's a bit easier. With nation states, it's a bit different because they want to get a particular piece of information, for example, student records from a particular university, and they'll throw resources and human capital at that to allow them to be able to access that information and get to it. And they won't really stop until they get it. So that makes it really difficult to defend, and it makes it, it's a much harder prospect for companies and small organisations to defend against when they've got a whole state, for example, a state as large as China, going after them.
We know that data breaches can have a pretty big impact on businesses financially. You mentioned when it's a private breach, a lot of the time the intent is to try and get money out of that business, but it can also affect the trust that the public places in those businesses that are affected, can't it?
Well, that's right. There's not just the financial impact, there's this whole issue around reputation. So if you're, for example, supplying into a sensitive field, if you're a defence contractor and you disclose that you've been breached and your plans have been and your designs have been stolen by a nation state, that really undermines your credibility in that space and probably undercuts your business model in that field. You can also have consumer trust. So if you breach a whole bunch of consumer data about what individuals are buying or personal information, their CVs and the like, that can really undercut people's trust in that consumer brand, and that can also be devastating. What I see in my job is when companies come to us and you hear behind the scenes these stories where they've had a data breach, and sometimes when it's become public, that can almost cripple their business to the point where they almost go bankrupt. Because it can be so damaging when people that are using those products or platforms suddenly cut them off because a data breach is too risky for them to touch for a while. So it can be, I think, really damaging for businesses, but I don't think businesses are quite yet paying enough attention to the risk.
So what can be done? What can businesses do to try and prevent their operations from being affected or from being targeted?
Well, I think if you're an organisation and you've got a board, for example, I'd be making sure that this is something that is on the board agenda every single time they meet, understanding the risks that they face from a breach, and then instructing their staff to make sure that they take steps to lower that risk. So one thing I think on every board's agenda should be understanding which data sets they have and which are the most important for them. It will be different in every organisation, but there'll be some data sets that are very important. For example, ones that hold personal information that could be damaging to the brand. There could be intellectual property that's very important to protect, and you want to take steps to try and better secure that information. There's other steps you want to take as well. You want your staff to be trained up in basic cyber hygiene skills so that they can spot malicious emails, so that they take basic precautions when they're operating their computer. So I think there's a bunch of things that organisations can do. It's pretty low bar. Not a lot of this is rocket science to raise your basic cyber hygiene, your basic protections, but more and more Australians and more Australian companies need to do more.
What about consumers? Is there any protection measures that consumers can put in place to try and be careful with who they give their information to? I mean, it's pretty widespread. We see data breaches occurring across a lot of different industries. So is there any way we know that our information is protected?
Well, one piece of reassurance that you do have now is the mandatory data breach laws. So when your information is compromised at any number of organisations that hold your personal information, you now do receive a notice letting you know that your information has been breached. That may not be a lot of comfort, given that you then may have, just be told that your identity may be compromised at some future point by cyber criminals, and you have to try and, wind that back and take steps to try and, change your credit cards, change your your details with your bank and all that sort of thing. So it can be pretty cold comfort, but at least it's happening. I think the reality is in this day and age, you have to give over your personal information to do business with lots of organisations, and the reality is that those organisations are going to be compromised. I think that doesn't mean you can't be a little bit more careful. If you think about the way that we use our credit cards, for example, lots of people would have experienced credit card fraud. They probably have an inclination about where their credit card may have been compromised. And so thinking through things like, how you use your credit card and the people that you give your credit card number to, and making sure you're using it with reputable organisations and being a little bit discreet with how you go about doing things like that, I think is very important.